Bhimji is a treacherous and perfidious man, an envoy from Mocha vehemently protested in Bombay. At present, he carries on much business and has many dealings within the Mocha territories and acts as broker to nearly all those who frequent his parts. But when the duties of brokerage are demanded from him, he declares that he is a servant of your government. The envoy was sent to Bombay in October of 1821 by Amir Fathullah, the Dawla, meaning governor of Mocha, to inveigh against the personal conduct of Bhimji Kalyanji, an affluent Gujarati merchant who served as the East India Company's principal broker in Mocha. More than a simple mercantile disputation, however, as the Dawla's appeal to British metropolitan authorities suggests, Bhimji's claim to company protection was embedded in a heated, ongoing dispute about imperial jurisdiction and the right to exercise sovereignty in southwestern Arabia, fanning anxieties in Mocha, Sana'a, and Istanbul about the looming threat of British legal imperialism. Commonly couched in claims of extraterritorial jurisdiction over its subjects, the imposition and enforcement of British legal authority, principles, and institutions in foreign territories played a significant role in the expansion of Britain's informal empire. Claims to protection based on ethnicity, religion, or shared moral values provided a basis on which to establish arrangements of layered sovereignty and legal pluralism, often evolving into intrusive and intimate colonialisms, which in turn allowed political and economic ends to be achieved without recourse to territorial conquest. As Kayleigh Wilkinson has recently argued, no less significant than histories of colonial seizure and exploitation was the nebulous history of Britain's empire of influence. In the Indian Ocean, a battery of fortified coastal trading ports known as factories served as islands of domestic jurisdiction, allowing Europeans to trade while remaining insulated from unfamiliar and potentially unfavorable local legal systems. By the mid-19th century, however, events like the First Opium War in China and the Don Pacifico affair in the Mediterranean had vividly demonstrated that extraterritorial rights over British subjects could be militarized and, when politically expedient, enforced at the barrel of a gunboat. In this evolving landscape, British Indian subjects, namely merchants from Gujarat and Kutch, served as vital conduits carrying British law into frontiers of informal empire, where ethnic Britons could not or would not operate. The politics of protection could, however, be a double-edged sword, as when Indians embarrassed the British vis-a-vis local authorities, or appealed to the latter to evade British law. Indians had good reasons to both assert and deny their ties to the British, moving within and across jurisdictions as it suited their interests. As this suggests, the politics of protection were often barbed and contentious. In Zanzibar, for example, Britain struggled for more than 3 decades to impose its jurisdiction over a resistant Gujarati merchant community disinclined to forgo access to enslaved labor, until an act of parliament passed in 1876 put the matter to bed by formally making the subjects of Indian princely states into British Indian subjects in East Africa. There was, however, more than abolition at stake for Britain, as the transformation of the Indians from, to quote Abdul Sharif, an indigenized merchant class to an entrenched alien body through which to go for the economic jugular of the Omani state, end quote, facilitated the de facto subjugation of the Sultanate of Zanzibar several decades before the formal institution of the East Africa Protectorate in 1895. While significant scholarship has been devoted to extraterritoriality in the Western Indian Ocean, Southwestern Arabia has not received much treatment in this literature, despite the region's long and deep-standing ties with India. The Mocha trade, crucial to financing Bombay's struggling treasury, was so thoroughly in the hands of Gujarati merchants that officials in India would have considered Viscount Valentia's remark in 1805 that Banyas nearly monopolized Mocha's trade as mundane and obvious. Valentia had been sent by Bombay to southwestern Arabia with the objective of expanding British influence in this consequential commercial and strategic hub. But like a previous mission, dispatched by the Foreign Office in 1802, the Irish peer's efforts had come to naught. Consequently, it should come as little surprise that a decade after Valentia's failed expedition, Mocha, along with its entrenched Indian merchant communities, became an experimental site for the development of new topologies of British legal imperialism. In this talk, I will trace an early attempt at the extraterritorial penetration of southwestern Arabia. In the wake of an outrageous attack On the British factory in July of 1817, an expeditionary force of the Bombay Marine was dispatched to blockade and bombard Mocha. Subsequently, an unequal treaty was imposed upon Imam al-Mahdi Abdullah of Sana'a, the sovereign of Mocha, restructuring commercial relations and jurisdictional boundaries in the port. Previous accounts have depicted the incident as a standard rehearsal of British gunboat diplomacy, overlooking an important legal innovation enfolded in the Anglo-Yemeni Treaty, wherein the company claimed jurisdiction not only over ethnic Britons and other dependents of the factory, but over the entire Gujarati merchant population of the port, a full 2 decades before similar claims would first be made in Zanzibar. Prosaically enough, however, Bombay's intervention was foiled by an inaccurate translation of the treaty from English to Arabic. That something as seemingly banal as a document's translation was enough to throw a spanner in the work of the imperial legal apparatus brings into sharp relief the degree to which company officials were at the mercy of non-Western middlemen, often drawn from the same groups and communities co-opted as instruments of legal imperialism, who brokered between them and local rulers and administrators. A second line of inquiry in this talk will thus look at the structural vulnerabilities of informal empires, reflecting, without aiming to be definitive, upon the potential of contradictions and untranslatabilities between British imperial and Arab Islamic legal and epistemological assumptions in shaping the outcomes of the imperial encounter in the Western Indian Ocean. Situated at the mouth of the Bab el-Mandab Strait in the southern Red Sea, the port of Mocha rose to prominence in 1538 following the Ottoman conquest of Yemen, propped up as the empire's primary Red Sea foothold and key administrative, commercial, and communications hub. The port continued to thrive under the Qasimi Imams of Sana'a, who threw off the Ottoman yoke in the 17th century. A regional entrepot of consequence, Indian Ocean merchants flocked to Mocha to participate in the trade of Arabian coffee, Indian textiles, and South and Southeast Asian spices, aromatics, medicinal products, bulk metals, and more. English and Dutch trading establishments had been present in Mocha already by the 17th century, but it was only in the 18th century that the port became marked by the presence of settled Europeans, including the Dutch, English, and French East India companies. Serving as the primary redistribution center for markets in southwestern Arabia, as well as Abyssinia and the Horn of Africa, Mocha provided a key outlet for Indian as well as European manufacturers in the Gulf of Aden. In addition to the highland Yemeni coffee trade, the bulk of merchandise bought and sold in Mocha was imported by the predominantly Bora merchants of Surat, whose mercantile fleet departed India every fall laden with foodstuffs, bulk metals, European manufactures, and textiles from Gujarat, only a small portion of which, though, was consumed in Mocha itself, the rest being re-exported to regional hubs such as Jeddah, Massawa, and Berbera on returns of hides and skins, incense, ivory, and bullion. Consequently, throughout the early modern period, Mocha was deeply imbricated in the colonial economy of Western India. The port was indispensable for the financial viability of Bombay, as the Red Sea trade brought in large annual consignments of bullion, which were then transmitted from Surat through native remittance networks. By the middle of the 18th century, however, a protracted civil war in Yemen significantly reduced Mocha's trade, while the emergence of first cotton and later opium as lucrative export commodities to China relieved Bombay of its dependence on Mocha's diminishing markets. By the end of the century, the decline of its interest in the region prompted the company to significantly reduce its presence in the Red Sea. In addition to the Surat merchants who traded seasonally with the port, a settled community of Banyas resided permanently in Mocha. Comprising both Hindus and Jains, the term Banya, derived from the Sanskrit word Vanaya, meaning trader or merchant, signifies both particular caste groups and a professional category, accommodating a wide range of social groups engaged in specialized commercial activity. Banya merchants carried an extensive trade in export items, notably in piece goods, extending from the productive inlands of Western India to port cities throughout the Western Indian Ocean. Banya Shroffs, the region's most considerable purchasers of bullion and foreign coin, built up elaborate trans-regional networks with credit in the form of hundis traveling through its sinews to finance oceanic trade ventures and remit its proceeds. As in other major ports of the Arabian Sea, Banyas like Bhinji ran the show in Mocha, handling all the land-based functions of the trade and its accounting through a monopoly over various commercial functions, including brokerage and banking. Banyas and Mocha provided an interface between the Indian Ocean and the burgeoning world economy, mediating sales of Yemeni coffee and India goods between an eclectic array of terrestrial merchants and maritime customers, including Arab, American, and European buyers. European East India companies employed brokers like Bhimji to conduct their affairs, inspect potential goods for sale, make bids and arrange delivery of purchased items, and lend capital for purchases. At the same time, being wealthy, foreign, and easily othered as heathen, Banyas were easy prey for rapacious dawlas seeking to replenish their perennially pinched government coffers or to line their own pockets. Viscount Valentia observed the dawla's habit of, quote, squeezing money from the Banyans, employing a cruel repertoire of extortion mechanisms ranging from beatings to confining merchants in a room and fumigating them with sulfur until they complied with his demands. Another European observer described the Banyans as the milk cows of the Arab government. The supposed duties evaded by Bhimji, according to the Dawla's envoy, referred to such ad hoc levies exacted on Gujarati brokers and merchants who were compelled, quote, to contribute whatever sums may be annually required to meet the exigencies of the state, end quote. Bhimji had been compliant in the past, but had recently begun to refuse these impositions. Amir Fathullah was inclined to make him comply, quote, by harsh measures, but upon the intercession of the British resident, decided to take up the matter with Bombay. The Dawla was furious that Bhimji should invoke British protection to shirk his charges. In fact, it was thought by some in Bombay that Amir Fathullah and his counselors believed that Bhimji himself was the reason occasioning Bombay to blockade and bombard Mocha the year before. A serious diplomatic incident had taken place 4 years prior, involving, in the words of its hapless protagonist, the grossest villainy and cowardice that ever were known, perhaps in the annals of modern history. On the 10th of October, 1817, in reprisal for an attempt to thwart an act of collusion between the captain of an Arab-flagged vessel chartered to the company and the incumbent Dawla, Haji Fatih, an officer of the Bombay Marine was brutalized by a mob of the Dawla's soldiers who stormed into the British factory, severely beat and bludgeoned him, and dragged him half naked through the streets of Mocha to the Dawla's residency, where he was further humiliated, spat on, and, quote, saluted by the name of kafir and dog. Nearly 3 years had elapsed in fruitless negotiations, but in August of 1820, emboldened by the recent naval rout of the Gulf Sheikdoms and the signing of a general treaty with its Arab rulers, Bombay dispatched Captain William Bruce, the company's resident in Bushire, to demand indemnification and an apology from the Imam for the indignities shown to the British flag in his port. Bruce was instructed to employ any means necessary to secure these objectives, but Bombay had no intention of simply reverting to the status quo ante upon satisfaction of its demands, determined instead to use the affair to restructure commercial and political relations in the region. After having largely vacated the Red Sea in the late 18th century, the British had recast their eye on the region following the French conquest of Egypt and the prospective move on India in 1799. The affairs of the government of India in the Arabian Sea were thus subordinated to an imperial geostrategic policy of employing British trade as leverage to compel local rulers in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf areas to align with British interests. Mocha emerged as a key site in the prospective Red Sea network, but successive missions dispatched by the Foreign Office in Bombay to extract trade concessions from the Imam had failed comprehensively to secure any advantage for Britain. Although strategically Britain was left pleased with the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, which had left its navies unrivaled in the Red Sea, the factory in Mocha proved inefficient and ineffective in projecting British might through commerce, largely due to the port's coffee trade having fallen into the hands of American merchants, who enjoyed a favorable tariff schedule not extended to their British counterparts. The attack on the factory then presented Bombay with a window of opportunity and a convenient pretext to compel Imam al-Mahdi to sign a commercial treaty favorable to British interests, including a reduced 2.25% flat duty on all imports and exports, down from 3.5% and 7.5% levied on Britons and Gujaratis, respectively. Now, forcing unequal commercial treaties upon foreign polities was by then an established British practice. But Bruce was sent to Mocha with more than just commercial imperialism on the agenda. Rather, Bruce's treaty was to stipulate that the Imam recognized British legal custodianship not only over Britons and certain native dependents of the factory, but over the entire Indian community of Mocha. The assertion of extraterritorial jurisdiction over non-Britons was not new in itself. In the Ottoman context, subjects to the Sultan, recruited as interpreters, warehousemen, brokers, and money changers, had for centuries shared in certain fiscal and juridical privileges afforded to their European employers. Crucially, however, these privileges extended only to non-Muslim subjects of the Sultan. Bruce's treaty, in contrast, demanded jurisdiction over all Indians, from settled Banyas like Bhimji to the itinerant, predominantly Muslim merchants of Surat. Previous treaties, such as the one signed in 1802 with the Sultan of neighboring Aden, had likewise sought to secure for British subjects a favorable tariff regime, assurances for personal safety, and jurisdiction for an officer to oversee their legal affairs. In the Aden Treaty, however, the term British subject referred specifically to ethnic Britons and European subjects of the Crown. Moreover, British protection over Indians was articulated as a form of patronage or sponsorship, requiring certificates issued in either of the presidencies in India to be registered in the offices of the Qadi and the British resident in Aden. The treaty thus distinguished between two separate notions of subjecthood: natural ethnic subjecthood and an acquired and implicitly impermanent subjecthood, contingent upon a declaration of association that had to be ratified by both Islamic and British imperial legal authorities. By 1820, however, the two-tiered approach was jettisoned. Enlisting the beneficiaries of the protection of the British flag, Bruce noted, quote, all subjects of the British government trading to Mocha, and particularly the merchants of Surat, end quote, explicitly demarcating Indians as British subjects proper, doing away with contingent procedures such as registration or, for that matter, personal consent. The unwavering confidence of Bruce's assertion, however, belies a far more nebulous legal reality, as the conceptual boundaries of British subjecthood in the Indian subcontinent were anything but clear, not least to colonial administrators themselves. The ambiguity over the legal identity of Indians stemmed from the East India Company's own peculiar legal standing. The company owed its constitutional status to the British Crown and Parliament, but its legitimacy as a governing power was invested by the power of Mughal sovereignty. The determination of subjecthood, which presupposes the question of sovereignty, thus remained equivocal, or, as Suparna Sengupta argues, kept deliberately vague by the company as state. Bruce's treaty thus stood on shaky ground as it sought to extend the scope of subjecthood, and with it the legal premise of extraterritoriality, to encompass not only ethnic nativity or personal prerogative, but a looser, novel construction one might term mandated territorial affiliation. Bombay instructed Bruce to stipulate a dual system of arbitration, by which all internal disputes involving Britons and Gujaratis trading in Mocha would be adjudicated by the resident under British law. Even in arbitration of cases involving a subject of the Imam, the treaty posited, British subjects would hold the right to trial by a mixed tribunal, including the company resident. Now, owing to the Mocha government's habit of leaning heavily on the merchant community, the authority to represent Indians trading in the port would secure Britain unprecedented power to intervene in disputes potentially involving the highest echelon of Mocha's administration, up to and including the Dawla. Crucially, the treaty stipulated that all individuals employed by the company, quote, from the broker downwards, were to come under the exclusive control of the resident, who alone would possess the power of punishing them and redressing complaints against them, thus fully removing men like Bhimji Kalyanji from the juridical remit of the Dawla and Kabi. Bruce arrived in Mocha in October of 1820, where he was met by a delegation of the incumbent Dawla, Faqih Hassan, followed shortly by a representative from Sana'a who assured Bruce that all demands would be acceded to. When it quickly became clear, however, that the Sana'a delegation was merely filibustering, a blockading squadron proceeded to bombard the town. After 2 weeks of shelling, a second representative from Sana'a, Amir Fathullah, conveyed Imam al-Mahdi's disavowal of the Dawla's conduct and tendered an unconditional surrender. A week later, Amir Fathullah, now officially instated as Dawla, produced a letter from the Imam enclosing a firman, reducing duties to 2.25%. Over the course of the next day, copies of the treaties were returned, signed and sealed by the Imam and members of his council. Bruce returned to Bushire, a Lieutenant George Robson of the Bombay Marine was left in charge as temporary resident. It quickly came to light, however, that there had been some major discrepancies between the wording of the English and Arabic versions of the treaty regarding the scope of its remit and the identity of its beneficiaries. The reduced rates of duty to be levied on the English and their subject, for one, applied in the Arabic version, quote, to the English government and the English merchants alone. The crux of the incongruity lay, however, in the formulation of jurisdictional boundary. The clause stipulating that all differences among British subjects be decided by the resident was omitted, while the proposed dual system of arbitration was circumscribed in a peculiarly phrased Arabic translation, stating that in any dispute concerning the people, jama'ah, of the resident and a subject of the imam, the resident may be present in the court of the Qadi, who alone would decide in what manner the wrong has been committed and by whom. Should, quote, the English military, uskur, be found guilty, the resident was empowered to determine the offender's punishment, but only following a criminal procedure conducted by the Qadi according to Sharia law. Finally, and as we shall soon see crucially, the stipulation that all individuals employed by the company from the broker downwards were to come under the exclusive control of the resident was omitted entirely. The Anglo-Yemeni treaty thus neither extended the tariff reduction to the Gujarati merchants, nor bore any mention of extraterritorial jurisdiction over anyone other than ethnic Britons. For Francis Worden, Chief Secretary of the Government of Bombay, every advantage held out by the original treaty seems to have been lost. It may be questioned, we wrote acerbically to Bruce and Bashir, whether the British trade is not left in a worse state than it was before the treaty. How did an ostensibly straightforward process of translation end up producing a document so widely at variance with the original? For Bruce, the answer was clear. He had fallen victim to an act of subterfuge. Writing to Bombay from Bashir, he insisted that he had painstakingly gone over every stipulation with Amir Fathullah, and that the Arabic version of the treaty being anything other than an exact copy, quote, could only have arisen from my being deceived by the Arabic munshi who accompanied me, and who no doubt had his reasons for deviating so much from the original draft. British expansion into maritime Asia was fraught with the pitfalls of incommensurability. From the Malay archipelago to the shores of coastal southern Arabia, the company needed to navigate alien political, legal, linguistic, and cultural landscapes. British officials in the Western Indian Ocean were thus dependent upon an elaborate human infrastructure comprised of non-Western middlemen possessing the knowledge and practical skills required to articulate and render legible local idioms and practices. Like their counterparts in India, British officials in Arabia were dependent on munshis to mediate their interaction with foreign environments. The term munshi, derived from the Arabic verb insha, meaning to compose, as in a written document, and to educate, as in a youth, denoted a wide array of literary, political, and scholastic functions in the company's administrative apparatus, including writer, secretary, political assistant, advisor, interpreter, translator, and language instructor. Munshis employed by the company in the Gulf and Arabia hailed from merchant families boasting extensive social and commercial contacts throughout the region. Men like the Mocha Residency's Arabic munshi were thus key personages in spaces of informal empire, capable of reading and drafting materials in particular languages, hence Arabic munshi or Persian munshi, etc., possessing in-depth knowledge of social etiquette, political norms, and literary conventions, and holding a firm grasp over the realities and dynamics of regional politics. More than simply translators and informants, however, as the Anglo-Yemeni Treaty reveals, as they received information in one language and translated it to another, munshis actively shaped the meanings and ultimately the outcomes of the imperial encounter. By dint of a set of non-transposable, embodied knowledge, munshis often acted in the stead of their employers, who mostly lacked the requisite lingual and cultural proficiency to carry out official affairs unmediated, revealing an inherent structural vulnerability in the administrative apparatus of Britain's informal empire. The legal and cultural work of translation formed transmission choke points, rendering munshis into nodes of knowledge circulation, but equally importantly, of capture and constriction. Bruce's suspicion of the Mocha Residency's Arabic munshi, an Indian Bora named Said Hussein, was thus anchored in widely held anxieties by company officials of being misled were misrepresented by their munshis. The Bushir resident had somewhat vaguely stated in his dispatch to Bombay that Syed Hussein had his reason for deviating in his Arabic translation from the English original. Given the circumstance, it was not beyond reason for Bruce to suspect that Amir Fathullah, presumably conscious of the checks on his powers that the treated articles would impose, might have attempted to convince Syed Hussein to doctor and use the document. Yet, even with the potential motivation of currying favor with the governor, how likely was Syed Hussein to willfully deceive his employer and jeopardize the tremendously advantageous position he held as regulator of information flows to and from Britain's senior-most officer in the region? Moreover, as an expert in Southern Arabian politics, he would have known about the rapid turnaround in governance at the port, and that the future governors would not be bound by the incumbent Dawla's personal pledges. Perhaps rather than an act of subterfuge, Syed Hussein's mistranslation was simply down to human error. After all, it was not without precedence that a munshi should unintentionally misrepresent or fail to give the force of a treaty article that he was drafting. But the scope of the munshi's elisions in this instance exceeded mere accentuation. Unlike South Asian munshis, who were accustomed to negotiating religious and cultural differences, owing to a long pre-colonial history of bridging regional Brahminical traditions and a wider Indo-Islamic culture, company munshis in Arabia operated in an emphatically Muslim landscape. It is worth considering, then, whether the incongruity between Arabic and English document might have risen not from bad faith or incompetence, but rather from substantive contradictions and untranslatabilities between British imperial and Arab Islamic legal and epistemological assumptions. For one, the very word subject, as the Bushir delegation would have understood it, had no natural Arabic equivalents. The word was translated alternately as dependents, tabi'un, people, jama'ah, and merchants, tujjar, and only once in reference to subjects of the imam as ra'iyya, which is a collective noun best translated as subjects, but which invokes a paternalistic relation of the ruler as shepherd, ra'i, and that of his subject as flock, ra'iyya. Moreover, territorial conceptions of sovereignty and the attribution of subjecthood to secular notions of blood lineage and land of birth, as understood both in British common law and in extrajudicial approaches practiced in colonial settings, was fundamentally at odds with Islamic political theology, wherein subjecthood emanated from one's belonging to the community of believers and residing in the domains of a temporal ruler, sanctioned by and adhering to the precepts of Islamic law. Nor was this temporal ruler sovereign in the sense of having a free hand to make laws, but rather operated within a legal framework that was in the charge of jurists who worked in concert with the ruler but maintained their independence. Now, certainly there was much more to Muslim political history than strict adherence to doctrinal theory, but such a division of labor between religious and royal authority was particularly pertinent to Qasimi Yemen during the period under review, conforming to the 40-year reign of Muhammad bin Ali al-Shawkani as the Imamate's Qadi al-Qudat, meaning judge of judges. A scholar, judge, and reformer played a central role in reshaping the religious landscape in Yemen in the early 19th century. According to historian Bernard Haeckel, Shawkani rivaled, if not exceeded, Imam al-Mahdi in influence. His judgments carried out whatever they may be and whomever they concern, even if the Imam himself was implicated. A towering figure of Islamic reform, Shawkani's scriptural conservatism permeated every walk of Yemeni political life. Not an order by the Imam was promulgated, Haeckel recounts, without Shawkani's advice being taken. Shawkani instituted his reforms by placing his students in positions of influence across the Imamate. It is reasonable to speculate, then, that one such disciple, the Qadi of Mocha, held equal sway over his political counterpart, the Dawla. Considering this symbiotic conservative alliance between scholars and rulers, how legible would Syed Hussein have found the stipulations of Bombay's treaty, conceding legal authority over Hindu and Muslim subjects to a Christian officer whose very rights to reside and trade at the port were invested by Imamic fiat, within the religio-political lexicon of early 19th century Yemen. To Francis Warden, such questions were moot either way, as, quote, mistakes such as this could only originate in corruption, or a degree of neglect which on an occasion so important is nearly equally culpable. Bruce offered to return to Mocha to tender a literal translation of the contested article, but was instructed by the governor, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, to remain in the Gulf. Upon discovery of the discrepancies, Robson immediately applied to Imam al-Mahdi to amend the treaty, but the latter dismissed the request out of hand. Robson's permanent replacement, Captain Gideon Hutchinson, followed suit, writing to the Imam that since Governor Elphinstone had agreed to relinquish significant portions of the treaty, quote, in token of friendship and cordiality, the Imam might be actuated by the same sentiments and agree to the disputed clauses. Any such hopes were dashed, however, upon the arrival from Sana'a of Hussein Gula, a representative of the Imam deputized to confer with Hutchinson about the omissions. All disputes involving non-Britons, he informed the resident, including dependents of the factory and certainly the Gujarati merchant community, would be adjudicated by the Qadi according to Islamic law. Were all complaints of brokers and merchants like Bhimji Kalyanji, quote, alone to be cognizable by the resident, they would be rendered independent of the Qadi and Dawla. Gula concluded by stating that conceding on this point would not simply contravene the laws of Yemen, but the precepts of the Quran, and would be an abrogation of the Imam's duty and of the authority of the Sharia. In an attempt to break the deadlock, Elphinstone appealed in writing directly to the Imam, who replied tersely and conclusively, quote, the tenor of the Arabic version may not be contravened by neither you nor I. That which has not been written cannot now be inserted. While this triangulated legal debate was being hashed out between Sana'a, Bombay, and Mocha, events on the ground deepened and broadened the scope of the affair. Shortly after Bruce's arrival in Mocha, Bhimji had appealed to the officer about an outstanding debt owed to him of $31,500, adding that the Dowlahs had habitually exacted yearly loans of $1,100, which they never repaid. When a request for a further loan of $20,000 was later made upon the broker, this time from the Imam himself, Bhimji notified Hutchinson that he intended to refuse the loan, petitioning for protection against the Imam's anticipated wrath. It was against this backdrop that Amir Fathullah's envoy left Mocha for Bombay to protest Bhimji's conduct and dispute his appeal for British protection, ironically taking up the Banyas case in Bombay while refusing British jurisdiction over Indians in Yemen. Bhimji's petition, however, could hardly have come at a less opportune time. While Bombay and Sana'a were wrangling over the fine print, the bombardment of Mocha and the stipulations of the treaty that followed were the subject of uproar and controversy in Istanbul. The ground had for some years been shaking under the feet of Sultan Mahmud II. The young Sultan endured a tumultuous first decade to his reign, beginning with the loss of the mouth of the Danube and Bessarabia to Russia in 1812, the violent assertion of Serbian independence between 1804 and 1815, and the commencement of the Greek War of Independence mere months prior to the signing of the Anglo-Yemeni Treaty. The specter of territorial reversal boded even more menacingly in Arabia, where an ascendant Saudi emirate occupied in 1803 and 1804 the sacred sites of Mecca and Medina, the main source of legitimacy for a sultan claiming spiritual overlordship over the global Muslim ummah. Ottoman Egyptian forces dispatched by Mahmud II managed to quash the Wahhabi insurgency, albeit well over a decade later. But for the beleaguered Sultan, the purported encroachment on Arabian soil by Britain, an imperial power governing more Muslims around the globe than did the Sultan Caliph himself, was interpreted as the opening gambit of a broader move to unseat the Ottomans in Arabia. The Porte warned the British ambassador, Viscount Strangford, that the Sultan, who retained a contested claim to sovereignty over the Yemen, perceived the affair to be an indication of Britain's ambitions in Arabia. Both Bombay and Calcutta categorically rejected the accusations, but the Sultan, distrustful of an India government, quote, as faithless and ambitious as that of Russia, was at pains to stress that he would not yield an inch of territory which had been sanctified by the footsteps of the Prophet. The Porte demanded that the British government disavow its resident in Mocha and acknowledge full and exclusive Ottoman sovereignty over the Yemen, leaving London scrambling for explanations from Bombay. Now, as historians of the late Ottoman Empire have shown, The acceleration of imperial expansion in the latter decades of the 19th century forced the Sultan's successors into an urgent and increasingly elaborate engagement with international law and Western claims for extraterritorial jurisdictions over non-Ottoman Muslims. For the time being, however, the Sultan could breathe easy, as Britain had much more to lose than to gain. It was feared in London that the Ottomans, who straddled the maritime choke points regulating vital flows of Black Sea grain to Europe, might attempt, as they ultimately did, to hurt the Greek revolutionaries by checking the trade carried by Greek merchants and ship owners. Had Bhimji's claims for British protection stood on a more solid legal footing, it is plausible that Britain might have been dragged into a conflict it wished to avoid. In the event, however, Bombay quietly retracted its claim for jurisdiction over Bhimji and other Indians in Mocha for fear of further antagonizing the port. Anglo-Yemeni relations were thus left in a state of ambiguity, but the matter of protection over Indians in Mocha persisted. The new resident, Captain Michael Bagnold, reported in 1825 that not only were injustices being carried out in the customs house, but that loans were again forcefully exacted from banyas at the port. Periodic exactions and oppressive conduct against Gujaratis had forced successive residents to intervene, but in 1826, Bagnold's vigilante action to claim redress for Gujaratis at the port nearly ended in another diplomatic collision with the port. To the company's relief, the incident passed without notice in Istanbul, but still was enough to make the governor rethink the cost-benefit trade-off of Bombay's Red Sea commitment. Finally, in October of 1827, Bagnold was informed that Bombay had decided to withdraw the residency from Mocha and to leave British commercial interests under charge of a native agent. The resident was instructed to facilitate the withdrawal and appoint a successor agent, for which position he designated a young Indian Bora merchant, quote, of respectable standing in Surat, whose character and reputation, it was hoped, would place British interests on a more respectable footing than our late useless Banyan broker, Bhimji Kalyanj. In this talk, I've argued that local agents and merchants played an outsized role in shaping and determining the outcomes of imperial intervention. Recurrent petitioning by the Surat merchants and the company's Banya brokers' insistence on invoking British protection serves to illustrate that, rather than just passive beneficiaries, non-Western merchants, brokers, and other intermediaries were in fact key agents of legal imperialism, in that by holding the company up to its own claims regarding territorial sovereignty in India and its attendant legal obligations abroad, they pushed the British to take on additional diplomatic responsibilities beyond the subcontinent. Moreover, as the treaty's contested clauses demonstrate, knowledge gaps and linguocultural barriers meant that works of translation were indispensable at every level of imperial operation. Munshis, brokers, and agents formed nodes of knowledge circulation as well as of capture and constriction, serving not only as the eyes and ears, but often as the mouths of imperial administrators. Their sparse mention in the colonial record thus belies an underlying ubiquity. Bearing this in mind, the foregoing allows us to throw into relief an understudied facet of legal imperialism, namely that the imposition of legal systems, structures, and practices on colonized or otherwise influenced regions was predicated upon legal and cultural works of translation. The influence of British authority, then, while crucial, can only be fully understood in the context of its dependence upon networks of indigenous commercial, political, and legal brokers to empire. The imposition of verbal constructs, I posit, could and did shape outcomes with equal force to the violent coercion of the gunmen.